am Frances Callier.
And I'm Angela V. Shelton.
And we're Frangela.
You know what you need in your life? The Final Word podcast.
Yes, you do.
That's right. It is the final word on all things political and pop cultural.
Where we make real news real funny.
Where we inspire you so you can #resist.
Subscribe and get a new episode of the Final Word podcast each week. It's the news we think you need to hear.
That's right. We think you need to hear it. Okay?
Yeah, it's what we say so.
That's right. And because all we do is give, every Thursday you can listen to our hysterical podcast, Idiot of the Week.
We round up the stupid because you know what? Somebody has to.
Okay. All we do is give.
Our press secretary gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome back to Unspun. You know, bombs are dropping in the Middle East, and before I get to today, I want to go back in time to April of 2023, when the U.S. was invading Iraq. American tanks had quickly crossed the country and entered the capital, Baghdad, and there were even tanks in the city itself. I remember driving to work every morning listening to NPR journalist Ann Garrels reporting from the Palestine Hotel, as she described it as naked and in the dark, to keep a satellite phone hidden. She said if she was undressed and agents knocked at her door, the time that they would give her to put something on would also give her time to take apart the phone and hide its pieces. Garrels was one of the reporters from around the world who gathered in hotels and press centers trying to understand what was going on as Saddam Hussein's government started losing control. There were those voices from journalists, but there was also one that really puzzled me, and his name was Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf. Al-Sahaf was Iraq's information minister, which meant that during the war, he served as the government's chief spokesman. Like most information ministers, his job was to brief reporters, telling them what the Iraqi government said was happening on the battlefield. He didn't have a news job, he had a PR job, and one big part of it was telling both home and international audiences that Iraq was successfully fighting off invaders. And really, government at war has someone in this role everywhere. In the United States, it could be a Pentagon spokesman or a White House press secretary. In other countries, it might be an official in the defense ministry. There's different titles, but the meaning is exactly the same, shaping how the public sees the conflict. That's pretty normal, but al-Sahaf got two unflattering nicknames, Baghdad Bob and Comic Ali, because of what he said with great confidence, mind you, that was sometimes wildly different from what reporters could just see for themselves. Have a listen.
They are not near Baghdad. Don't believe them. They are nowhere. This is silly.
To the reporters in that room, these kind of statements were completely bizarre and surreal. Some of them had already seen American troops on the streets in Baghdad. In some cases, you could even hear gunfire and shelling outside of the press gaggle. But the Iraqi government's official position was that the invasion was a nothing burger and that the Iraqi forces were winning. But honestly, the story is a little more complicated. Most people inside Iraq just didn't have access to independent reporting at the time. TV was controlled by the state, and like most autocratic regimes, dissent meant really painful consequences. So those ludicrous statements were given to the international press, but those reporters maybe were not the real audience. Those remarks were aimed at Iraqi citizens because they might only hear the government's official version of the events. It was part of how the government tried to keep up morale as the war unfolded, and that raises an important part about how information works during wartime. Al-Sahaf became famous because the gap between what he said and what reporters could verify was just so obvious, Journalists in Baghdad could look out their hotel windows, they could talk to soldiers, and they could compare the official statements to what they were actually seeing. That independent access let them call shenanigans on what the spokesfolks were saying. But imagine a different world. Maybe journalists cannot move freely. They can't talk to people or see the battlefield firsthand. If you're in an environment like that, the official version might be the only version the public ever hears. So here's the facts, truth seekers. In modern conflicts, battles over information are becoming almost as intense as the fighting itself. I am recording in the week of March 16th, 2026. And early this week, President Donald Trump posted a message on Truth Social arguing that both Iran and major news organizations are spreading AI-generated images and false reports about military attacks. According to the president's post, those reports were fake news designed to make Iran look stronger than it actually is. The president even suggested that media outlets airing those stories should be liable for treason. In other words, there's already a fight over what version of events the public should see, and it's not new. Governments have always tried to shape how citizens understand wars. Sometimes these explanations are correct, sure. Sometimes they leave out inconvenient details, and sometimes history shows they turn out to just be wrong. One of the most important moments in modern journalism is when reporters find out that the official story about a war is not the whole story. Someone leaks documents or pictures, reporters investigate, and they uncover events that governments have tried to hide. And when these stories finally reach the public, they fundamentally change how people understand the war itself. So today, we're going to look at how governments and journalists tell us what's happening in war. We will look at the times when the government story falls apart in the face of reported truth. We'll talk about how war reporting has changed since World War II. And we'll examine why independent journalism is often the only way the public can verify what their government tells them during conflicts. Because history shows us something important about war reporting. The first version of the story, it's rarely the final one. Sound interesting? Let's get unspun. So if Baghdad Bob represents the most obvious version of wartime narrative control, the natural question is what happens when these messages stop working? Well, we have some lessons from history which show that journalists create the most important corrections of those official war stories when they find out that the government isn't telling the whole story. A famous example of this happened during the Vietnam War. For years during the 1960s, American presidents and military leaders told the public that the war in Vietnam was tough, but it was winnable. And every time they sent more troops or dropped more bombs or asked for more funding, they called it a necessary step that would lead to success. To the press and to the public, officials talked about progress in terms of body counts and territory controlled and weakening enemy forces. But inside the government, it turned out it was a very different conversation. In the late 1960s, a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg was working on a classified Department of Defense study that looked at how the U.S. became involved in Vietnam in the first place. That study included thousands of pages of documents, including records from policy discussions that went all the way to the White House. And what Ellsberg learned was disturbing. According to those documents that he reviewed, American leaders, privately, were seriously doubting that the war was winnable for years, maybe as early as the mid-1960s. And despite that, more money and more soldiers were headed to Asia, and a lot of those soldiers were not coming home. The public story at press conferences was really different from what the leaders were really saying behind the scenes. Ellsberg eventually made an extraordinary decision to leak the documents to the New York Times, which began publishing excerpts from what became known as the Pentagon Papers. What a scandal this was. According to the excerpts, 4 successive presidential administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, had misled both the Congress and the public. The Nixon administration's way of handling the scandal was to lean on the press, asking the courts to rule that the Times couldn't publish it. The administration argued that the reporting threatened national security, and ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that the newspapers could continue publishing the material. Now, the Pentagon Papers did not end the Vietnam War right away, but they did make a big difference in how Americans viewed what their leaders said about the conflict. People maybe trusted government explanations less, and the episode became one of the clearest demonstrations of how journalism can check political power. Now, here's another example from the same war, and it revealed something even more disturbing. In March of 1968, American soldiers entered a Vietnamese village called My Lai, an incursion that officials described as a successful engagement against Viet Cong fighters. More than a year later, a freelance journalist named Seymour Hersh began investigating rumors about a soldier named Lieutenant William Calley, who was facing charges related to the incident. Hersh was relentless in his investigation, and he followed the story, interviewing soldiers and getting testimony that contradicted that official account. And what he uncovered was actually a massacre. It turned out that American troops had killed hundreds of unarmed women, children, and elderly villagers. It wasn't a chaotic battlefield accident, it was a sustained series of shootings over several hours. And the Army had known about the incident for more than a year before the story became public. Hersh's reporting was published along with photographs from Army photographer Ronald Haberly, and it shocked audiences around the world. Photos showed bodies of civilians lying in ditches and fields. It was not a controlled military operation. And for many Americans, the My Lai revelations forced them to confront what the war in Vietnam had actually looked like on the ground. Decades later, another war would produce a similar moment. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, American officials repeatedly told the public that U.S. forces were operating under strict rules that were designed to protect prisoners and civilians. The attack was framed as both a strategic operation and a mission that was fully aligned with international law. But then in 2004, photographs began circulating that told a very different story. These were images from the Abu Ghraib prison outside Baghdad, where American soldiers had been guarding Iraqi detainees. The photographs showed prisoners being humiliated, threatened with dogs, forced into painful stress positions. Some detainees were actually photographed naked and stacked up in degrading poses, while American soldiers in the background laughed nearby and gave thumbs up. It was gross, and it was one of the defining scandals of the Iraq War. The journalistic publication led to investigations that eventually revealed that the abuse wasn't just a few rogue soldiers, but it was part of a broader pattern of interrogation practices that were authorized higher up the chain of command. So if we look across these cases, we can kind of see a pattern, right? In the beginning, the public knows what happened because leaders tell them. And the news that the officials give is a rosy story of success or legitimacy, or that we've got the situation under control. And it took journalism to show the truth. Sometimes that evidence came from leaked documents. Sometimes it came from interviews, and sometimes it came from images so powerful that they demanded someone investigate. But there's another effect too, and it's one that we talk about less. After experiences like these, governments begin to question how they might allow journalists to cover wars in the first place. These changes in the relationship between militaries and the media are still affecting today's war reporting. I'm going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll look at how governments and militaries have changed the rules of war coverage after Vietnam. I'll be right back. Welcome back. For older Americans, the Vietnam conflict often defines war reporting issues. Between the Pentagon Papers, the reporting on My Lai, and the nightly TV images coming home from the battlefield, it seemed like journalists played a major role in turning public opinion against the war. Now, to be fair, historians still argue about whether this is an accurate interpretation. But one thing is clear. Many political and military leaders came away from Vietnam convinced that the press had far too much freedom to observe and report on military operations. And that belief has shaped how the United States and other governments have approached war coverage ever since. During World War II, and in most of the Vietnam War, journalists had pretty open access to military units. Correspondents traveled with troops, they interviewed soldiers and officers, and they sent their stories and pictures and video back to newspapers and broadcasters. There certainly was censorship, but overall, everyone assumed that reporters would witness the war directly and describe what they saw. By the 1980s, though, the relationship between the military and the media started to change. One big turning point came in 1983 during the U.S. invasion of Grenada. President Ronald Reagan ordered American troops to invade the tiny island country in the Caribbean. The biggest reason Reagan gave to the public was that he wanted to protect Americans who were stuck on the island. There were about 1,000 Americans living there, including 600 students going to medical school at St. George's University. Just a few years before this, Iranian revolutionaries had taken 52 Americans hostage and held them for over a year. Reagan was worried something similar might happen to these students if things got worse in Grenada. But there was more going on than just protecting the students. This was during the Cold War, and Grenada was friendly with Cuba and the Soviet Union. The island was building a big new airport, and Reagan thought Cuba and the Soviet Union might use it as a military base. And on top of all of that, several small islands near Grenada called the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States actually asked the U.S. to step in so that the violence and chaos wouldn't spread from Grenada to their own countries. Things came to a head in October 1983 when Grenada's government basically fell apart in a kind of a violent way. The country's leader, Maurice Bishop, was killed on October 19th by people in his own government who wanted to be even more extreme. A guy named Bernard Kouad took over and put the whole island under what's called a shoot-on-sight curfew, meaning soldiers could shoot anyone they saw outside. The whole place descended into chaos, and that's when Reagan decided to act. Just a few days after that violent coup, American troops landed on the island. Now, journalists did not travel with the troops, and in fact, they were kept about 170 miles away in Barbados for days. There was a group of 7 journalists who managed to reach the island on a private fishing boat, and they were intercepted by the U.S. Navy. And they were held incommunicado on the USS Guam for 2 days and prevented from filing any stories. When American forces landed on the island, journalists initially found themselves completely shut out. Reporters were not given access to the battlefield, and for a time, the press was scrambling to understand what was happening. The backlash from that, from the press and from Congress, led to the formation of a commission that recommended the creation of a national media pool to ensure some level of press access during war. Now, in the pool system, you have a small group of journalists who are chosen to accompany military, while the rest of the press relies on those journalists' reports and images. So in theory, the pool allows media coverage while it gives more operational control for the military. In practice, it also gives the military authorities a lot more ability to manage what reporters can see and how quickly the public gets information. That model showed up again during the 1991 Gulf War, when the United States led a coalition to push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. For viewers around the world, the Gulf War became the first conflict they saw through 24-hour TV news. CNN broadcast from Baghdad throughout the bombing campaign, and audiences watched nighttime footage. At the same time, journalists covering the coalition forces operated largely within the pool system, so they traveled on carefully organized trips and got briefings that framed the progress of the war. And in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Pentagon introduced a new system known as embedded journalism. Instead of moving journalists around in controlled groups, the military placed hundreds of reporters directly with combat units. Embedded journalists lived with the soldiers, they traveled in their vehicles, and they followed their units through the battlefield. Now, if you were watching this unfold on TV, it was dramatic reporting. You had cameras mounted on vehicles that captured firefights, and you could see tanks racing through the desert, oddly unimpeded. And it also gave journalists a level of access more than the older pool system. Reporters saw and they shared daily life within military units, which let their audiences see firsthand the experiences of the troops they were traveling with. But it also meant new constraints. Think about it. Embedded reporters were completely dependent on the military units for transportation and protection and food and shelter. So they could say a lot about the soldiers they were living with, but they missed out on the experiences of the civilians who were also experiencing the war. Researchers have studied hundreds of articles at the time and found that embedded reports focused a lot on the lives and perspectives of the coalition troops, and there were far fewer stories about Iraqi civilians, damage to buildings and other infrastructure, and just the broader social effects of the war. Embedding didn't eliminate journalism, but it surely did shape the coverage, and that illustrates a recurring issue for war reporters, which is this: access comes with conditions. You know, governments need journalists. Reporters can tell important stories and shape public opinion. But governments also want to limit what reporters can see and when, and they sometimes keep things out of the public eye because it's embarrassing or an inconvenience. And then at the same time, reporters have actual practical constraints. Reporting from a battlefield is both dangerous and expensive. Independent coverage requires that you secure transportation, security, translators, equipment, and those are resources that a lot of news organizations are increasingly reluctant to provide. In a little turn of irony, right now, there is military action from the U.S. and Israel in Iran. Just a few weeks ago, the Washington Post got rid of its Mideast desk. So today, the structure of war reporting reflects the realities of a combination of military policy and newsroom economics and physical risk. And that's just part of the story. For much of the 20th century, the public saw the war through just a few channels. There were newspapers that published reports from correspondents, there were radio broadcasts to deliver battlefield updates, and by the time of the Vietnam War, TV was bringing images of combat right into people's houses. But even then, the information moved predictably, right? Journalists gathered material, editors reviewed it, news organizations distributed it to their audiences. But over the last 20 years, technology has radically shifted the information environment of war reporting. And it's even more dramatically than military policy has, because the people documenting a conflict are no longer just professional journalists. Sometimes it's the citizens who are living through the war. Today, information can go from the battlefield to the global audience within seconds. Journalists report in real time with platforms like X and Instagram and Telegram. Smartphone videos go around the world before traditional news organizations have time to verify them. And in a lot of conflicts, the people who are documenting the events are not professional correspondents. They're also civilians who happen to be there when the history shows up. There's a striking example of this that emerged during the recent war in Gaza. Israeli military operations were intense, and international reporters were severely restricted on even going into Gaza. So a lot of the day-to-day documentation of this conflict has come from Palestinian journalists and civilians who are already living inside Gaza. One of the most widely followed voices is a young journalist named Bisan Oda. Oda began posting short video reports from inside Gaza City. She filmed on a smartphone, and she documented her damaged neighborhoods, families that had been displaced, the daily struggle to find food and water and shelter while being bombarded. Within months, her posts had reached millions of viewers around the world, and they were amplified by news outlets at Al Jazeera that frequently cited or rebroadcast her footage because it was one of the few continuous visual records that were coming directly from inside the conflict zone. Have a listen.
They are all. Ya Rab, Ya Sakir. Allah. Look at this! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! It's a bomb inside the sea. Oh my god! Oh my god! These people are really suffering. There are no safe places in Gaza. Now, while I'm shooting a bomb by what we call in Arabic الطراد, or it's a warship. So people are, fishing for some meters just inside the sea, and they were bombed. I don't know if they were injured. They are running now. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So no one is talking about injuries or anything that bombed.
So this is a new form of reporting. I think it also shows how digital media can complicate things. On the one hand, social platforms let anyone publish, and that can avoid censorship by the government or the military. But on the other hand, there are a whole bunch of new challenges in verification. People can share images and videos without context. You can take old footage and share it today and make it look new. Artificial intelligence tools make pretty convincing videos with just a few clicks. So journalists and researchers and fact-checking organizations spend enormous amounts of time trying to confirm the authenticity of digital material before they report it as a fact. But does it really matter, because the messages can go straight to the public anyway? This is why modern conflicts are often described not only as battles on land, sea, and air, but also as battles over information. And so that's where we are now. How do you learn about a war? Governments release official statements that may hide or shade facts. Journalists try to verify those claims independently with their own reporting. Civilians post videos that may or may not be fake. Analysts look at satellite images and digital metadata, and they publish their findings on social media or blogs. And so all of these sources are competing to shape how the public understands what is happening. So arguments about misinformation have become very central to modern conflicts. Political leaders frequently accuse their opponents or the media itself of spreading lies about military operations. And at the same time, journalists and researchers are warning that manipulated images, edited videos, AI-generated material, they're increasingly just part of the propaganda toolkit. In other words, the information battlefield has become almost as complex as the physical one. Before we move to our final section, it's worth taking a minute to think about what this means for the people whose job it is to verify these claims. Reporting from a war has never been easy, but for many journalists, it has also never been more dangerous. I'll take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the risks that reporters face when they try to document wars from the ground. Be right back. Welcome back. When people think about war reporting, they often imagine dramatic images, right? Reporters in flak jackets standing in front of burning buildings with microphones in their hand, explaining what just happened. What these images don't always show is how dangerous that work can be. Now, for most of the 20th century, war correspondents have accepted risk as part of their profession. Journalists traveled with the army, moved between front lines, and sometimes found themselves caught in the same dangers as the soldiers they were covering. But in most conflicts, reporters were not intentionally targeted. The expectation, at least in theory, is that journalists are observers and not participants. And even a journalist from an outlet from someone you're fighting against still helps get your story out. But that's not true anymore. In some modern wars, journalists have become targets themselves. There have been kidnappings and deliberate attacks on reporters. They're becoming more common. And international organizations that track press freedom now say that local journalists, people who are covering wars in their own countries, have some of the greatest risks. One of the most striking examples of this danger occurred in Syria in 2012. Marie Colvin was an experienced war correspondent for the Sunday Times of London. And by the point in her career when she got to Syria, she had already reported from conflicts all over the world, including wars in Syria and Chechnya and Libya. In early 2012, she entered the Syrian city of Homs, where the government was shelling a neighborhood known as Baba Amr. And it was a move that the government insisted was targeting armed militants and terrorists. But Colvin and other journalists found something different. They found heavy shelling of busy neighborhoods where just everyday people lived. Now, Colvin described what she was seeing live on international television. She described injured civilians being carried through makeshift clinics and families huddled in basements as artillery fire continued outside. Here's an example for you to listen to.
Every civilian house on the street has been hit. We're talking about, it's a very kind of poor, popular neighborhood. The top floor of the building I'm in has been hit. In fact, it's totally destroyed. There are no military targets here. There is the Free Syrian Army, heavily outnumbered and outgunned. They have only Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenades, but they don't have a base. There are more young men being killed. You see a lot of teenage young men, but they're going out to try to just help get the wounded to some kind of medical treatment. So it's a complete and utter lie that they are only going after terrorists.
Her reporting was really powerful. In one interview, she described watching a small child die from shrapnel wounds because doctors lacked the equipment needed to treat the injury. Just days after that report, Syrian artillery targeted the building where Colvin and other journalists were, and she and a French photographer died. Years later, a U.S. court concluded that the Syrian government had deliberately targeted the media center in an attempt to silence their reporting. And I feel like that's a stark reminder of the risks that journalists who try to document wars face. News organizations, the major ones, will now require reporters who are going into conflict zones to have hostile environment training courses. They learn how to recognize unexploded ordnance, how to treat severe injuries, how to survive being kidnapped. News organizations also buy ballistic helmets and body armor. So if you're a reporter working for a well-funded international media outlet, these resources can make you a little safer. But local journalists can't access that same training and equipment. And freelancers, who often work covering conflicts for multiple outlets at the same time, may not have that same protection that's available to staff correspondents. So lots of reporters documenting wars today do essential work in extremely dangerous conditions, often with few resources and no guarantee of protection. But without reporters willing to witness events firsthand, the public would not really have good ways to verify what governments say is happening. And that brings us back to that broader question we started with. If governments try to shape narratives about war and journalists try to verify or challenge those narratives, what happens when political leaders start by attacking the credibility of the press itself? This is where the modern information battle over war coverage becomes really intense. That strange figure of Baghdad Bob became a global punchline in 2003 because the gap between the press conference and the reality was just so obvious. Reporters could actually hear explosions behind him while he insisted that American forces were nowhere near Baghdad. But most wartime messaging is not that clear. Modern governments are usually a lot more careful in how they talk about war. They release data selectively, they choose their words carefully, and officials emphasize certain facts, but they leave others unexplained. And then sometimes the official story turns out to be premature instead of just completely false. There was a well-known example that came just a few weeks after the fall of Baghdad. On May 1st, 2003, President George W. Bush landed on the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and delivered a speech announcing that major combat operations in Iraq had ended. Behind him, there was a giant banner with a flag on the background that read "Mission Accomplished." Listen to what he said.
Captain Card, officers and sailors of the USS Abraham Lincoln, my fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. And now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country.
Bush sure sounded confident, but he was also not exactly right. The conflict and war did not end that day. In fact, later sectarian violence in Iraq produced years of fighting and thousands of additional deaths. Most American military deaths in Iraq happened after this speech was given. And in hindsight, this speech became one of the most famous examples of how wartime narratives get ahead of reality. Today, the struggle over who controls those narratives has become even more complicated. That message from Donald Trump that I mentioned at the start illustrates, I think, how modern wartime communication often includes accusations that the media just can't be trusted to report events honestly. And that puts journalists in a really tough position. Their role is to verify claims independently, to compare official statements with evidence from the ground. So the battle over the narrative begins as part of the conflict, and that brings us back to the lesson of Baghdad Bob. The difference between Baghdad in 2003 and the democratic societies of today is not that governments avoid shaping narratives during war. Every government does that and will continue to do that. Military briefings and official statements and strategic messaging are all part of how states communicate during conflict. The difference is that independent journalism faces some struggles in challenging those narratives. So the next time that you hear a government official describing what's happening in a war, it's worth asking yourself a few simple questions. First, what incentive might that spokesperson have to frame events in a particular way? Second, are journalists able to verify those claims independently? And third, is there evidence that supports the story that's being told? Because history shows us something important about war reporting. The first version of the story is rarely the final one. Thanks for listening to Unspun. Stay sharp, everyone. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at theunspunpodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at theunspunpodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.
Hey, it's Jody Hamilton.
And Sean Smith Pierce.
Here's a taste of what you might have missed from the Politics Bar.
Jody, I was listening to you this morning, filling in for Steph. You and Chris were debating, and just for the record, Jody is right. Chris's argument is that there is some truth to what's being said about the left being in their own information silo. Right.
Basically, we started talking about how Gavin Newsom has invited people on his podcast, high up MAGA guys.
Yeah. Well-known right-wing propagandists. That's what they are. Yeah.
And my argument is he shouldn't be inviting them because nobody on that side is listening to Gavin Newsom.
Right. It doesn't help to bring propagandists into a sphere where truth matters because they're just going to lie their asses off anyway.
Right.
So here is a public service message for Chris Lavoie. Jody Hamilton is right. Catch all that and more weeknights at the Politics Bar, available through your favorite progressive radio station, your favorite podcast player, or online anytime at thepoliticsbar.com.